Welcome to this deep dive, listener. Today we're going to be tackling a topic that's, it's pretty intense. The intersection of healthcare outrage and the death of a major health insurance CEO. We've got news articles for you, we've got social media posts, even some opinion pieces, all trying to make sense of this whole event and the reaction that followed.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, how this event has sparked such a strong reaction online and in the media. It really raises some important questions about how we view corporate accountability, the issues within American healthcare, and even how we express our emotions publicly, in this digital age.
Yeah, and it's not like this was just any CEO. This was Brian Thompson, head of UnitedHealthcare, and he was actually fatally shot. Now, you'd think a public figure like that would get at least some sympathy, when they pass away. But the reaction online was, well, let's just say it was less than respectful.
Right. And that's the big question here. Why such a strong, some would say insensitive reaction?
Well, to understand that, I think we need to zoom out a little bit. Look at the bigger picture, because it seems this outrage is coming from a place of deep frustration with the American healthcare system and the role that insurance companies like UnitedHealthcare play in it.
Okay, so let's get into it. Let's dive into one of the sources that you sent me that really digs into this article by Taylor Lorenz. It's called "Why We Want Insurance Executives Dead." Just the title alone kind of makes you stop and think.
Yeah, it's definitely provocative.
Lorenz argues that while the online reaction to Thompson's death is extreme, it does reflect a very real anger toward insurance companies and the way they operate and their practices. She points to how often these companies deny coverage for essential treatments, which can lead to real suffering, even death.
And here's where it gets really interesting. She goes beyond just making that claim, and she brings in the voices of people who've been personally impacted. She shares stories like a parent whose child was denied coverage for a crucial hospital stay after a heart surgery. It just makes it so much more real. Have you ever had a negative experience with a health insurance company, listener? We love to hear about it on our social media.
Those stories are really powerful, and Lorenz backs them up with hard data. She cites a report from ProPublica that found that a staggering 1 in 7 claims for medical treatment are actually rejected by insurance companies. And get this, UnitedHealthcare Thompson's company denies 32% of claims.
Wait, 32%? That's more than double the industry average.
Exactly, it's double the industry average, which makes you wonder, are they just being extra strict, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, it really makes you think.
Well, Lorenz actually digs into that in the article. She points out that UnitedHealthcare has been using these AI algorithms to help process claims and make decisions about coverage. But here's the catch. These algorithms are apparently flawed, and they've been denying care incorrectly at an alarming rate.
Hold on, so you're telling me a computer program is deciding who gets treatment and who doesn't? That's kind of scary, especially if it's making mistakes.
It is a little unsettling, right? Think of it this way. Imagine you're trying to teach a computer to tell the difference between a cat and a dog. You show it thousands of pictures, right? And you tell it, this is a cat, this is a dog. The computer learns to recognize those patterns. Pointy ears, fluffy tail, maybe even the way they walk. But what if some of those pictures are mislabeled? The computer could learn the wrong patterns and start calling a fluffy dog a cat. And that's kind of what's happening here with these algorithms. They're being trained on data. But if that data is biased or flawed, the algorithm's going to make biased and flawed decisions. Lorenz even quotes a whistleblower who claims the error rate for these algorithms is as high as 90%.
90%?
Yeah.
So basically 9 out of 10 times this thing is getting it wrong. That's terrifying. And it makes those stories about people being denied essential care even more upsetting. You start to see how these big systemic problems can trickle down and impact individual lives in such a real way.
Exactly. And to be fair to Lorenz, she does clearly state that she doesn't condone violence, even though the title of her article might suggest otherwise. But she's making a larger point here. She wants to shift the focus away from simply judging people for their online behavior and toward understanding the root causes of this outrage.
So she's basically saying, don't just criticize people for being angry, figure out why they're so angry.
Exactly. She wants to see that energy directed towards creating actual change in the healthcare system. Things like advocating for universal healthcare, pushing for more regulations on insurance companies, holding executives accountable for these harmful policies.
Okay, so the article itself is pretty intense. Gives us a lot to think about. But it's just one piece of the puzzle. What's fascinating is how the online reactions to this whole event were just all over the map. You had people making dark jokes, some expressing genuine grief for loved ones that they had lost, and others criticizing those who seemed to be celebrating the CEO's death.
It's almost like this event became this mirror, reflecting all the different ways people feel about healthcare in America. You've got anger, sadness, confusion, even some dark humor mixed in there. But before we jump into specific examples, I want to throw this out there. Do you think there's ever a time when it's okay to celebrate someone's death, even if you disagree with their actions? It's a tough question, but it's something to think about as we explore these reactions.
Yeah, it's complicated. There's no easy answer. I mean, on one hand, you have this powerful figure who represents a system that a lot of people feel is failing them. And on the other hand, you have a human being with a family who just lost their life. It's different.
Right. It's tough to find that balance between acknowledging the harm that's been done and remembering the humanity of the individual involved. But going back to Lorenz's article for a moment, she makes another interesting point. She says that focusing on the tone of these online reactions, whether it's the dark humor or the angry rants, actually misses the point entirely.
Okay, so instead of focusing on whether it's right or wrong for people to be making jokes about a CEO's death, we should be looking at why they're so angry in the first place.
Exactly. She argues that the real harm isn't in the insensitive comments online, but in the actions of insurance companies that are denying people essential health care. Actions that, in some cases, can have life or death consequences.
It's a powerful argument. It kind of flips the script, doesn't it? Suddenly, those dark jokes seem a lot less offensive when you compare them to the systemic issues that Lorenz is highlighting.
And she goes even further. She points out that this focus on online civility often comes from media outlets that have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. She specifically calls out Fox News, suggesting that they want to distract from the real problems by focusing on the uncivil behavior of individuals online.
It's like they're saying, look at those angry people on Twitter, they're the problem, not the healthcare system itself.
It's a classic case of what we call tone policing. Instead of engaging with the actual substance of the argument, they try to shift the focus to how it's being expressed. It's like saying, hey, I understand you're upset about your medical bills, but you shouldn't be so angry about it. Have you ever felt like that, listener? Like your concerns are being dismissed because you're not expressing them in a perfectly polite way?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Everyone agrees we should strive to be respectful in our interactions. But does that mean we can't be angry or passionate? What happens when that anger is justified? Do we just have to sit quietly and take it?
Lorenz argues that suppressing that anger can actually be more harmful in the long run. It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. Eventually, it's going to pop back up, often with more force than before. She wants to see that energy channeled into something productive, something that can actually create change.
So instead of just ranting on Twitter, people should be taking that energy and using it to push for policy changes. Hold corporations accountable. Make their voices heard in a meaningful way.
Exactly. And that brings us back to those online reactions we were talking about. Remember, they're not all just angry rants and dark jokes. There are also people sharing their personal stories. People expressing genuine grief for loved ones who they feel were failed by the system.
Right, and those stories are so important because they remind us that these aren't just abstract issues. They're real-life situations that have devastating consequences for real people.
Absolutely. And when you consider that context, those seemingly insensitive jokes start to look different. Maybe they're not actually about celebrating death, but about coping with a system that feels broken and unfair. Maybe it's a way of reclaiming some power in a situation where they feel powerless.
It's like that saying, humor is tragedy plus time. Maybe in this case it's tragedy plus frustration, plus a complete lack of faith in the system.
It's definitely a complex situation with a lot of different emotions at play. But before we wrap up this part of the deep dive, let's take a look at some specific examples of those online reactions. One that caught my eye was a tweet that said, "My empathy is out of network for this one." It's using the language of healthcare to express this lack of sympathy.
Oh, that's a good one. It's sharp, cynical, kind of funny. But you can definitely sense the frustration underneath. What other types of reactions did you see?
Well, on the other end of the spectrum, you have people posting about their personal experiences with UnitedHealthcare, detailing instances where they felt the company's policies caused them or their loved ones harm. Some of these stories are incredibly heartbreaking, like a woman who described how her husband was denied coverage for a life-saving cancer treatment and ultimately passed away. These are the voices that often get lost in the debate about civility.
It's a stark contrast, isn't it?
Yeah.
You have those more detached, almost darkly humorous comments alongside these deeply personal accounts of suffering and loss. And then, of course, you have the people who are pushing back against both sides, arguing that regardless of how you feel about the CEO or the company, finding joy in someone's death is never okay.
It's a valid point, and it speaks to the ethical questions surrounding how we respond to injustice. Even when faced with perceived wrongdoing, is celebrating someone's death ever justified? Where do we draw the line?
Yeah, it's a real dilemma, isn't it? How do we process those feelings? The anger, the grief, even this sense of vindication, all while recognizing that someone's life has been lost.
And it's even more complicated when you consider the whole context of the healthcare system, right? And the role of these corporations. Lorenz actually ties all of this back to the 2024 election, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I remember she had some pretty strong opinions about how healthcare was being discussed, or rather not discussed, during the campaigns.
Exactly. She pointed out that healthcare was a major issue for a lot of voters, but neither candidate seemed willing to actually address it, in a meaningful way. They were more focused on things like the economy or foreign policy. And even when they did talk about healthcare, it was always in these vague terms. There were no concrete plans for actually fixing the problems that people are dealing with.
It's like they were afraid to even touch this hot button issue.
Yeah, but Lorenz argues that that's exactly what they should have been talking about, especially considering all the anger and frustration that was already out there. She's particularly critical of the Biden administration for rolling back some of those healthcare benefits that were put in place during the pandemic. Things like Medicaid expansion, paid sick leave, increased unemployment benefits. And this was all happening while inflation was rising, incomes were stagnating, poverty was increasing.
So people were already struggling, right? And then the government takes away some of the support systems that were helping them stay afloat. It's no wonder there's so much anger and resentment.
It paints a pretty bleak picture, doesn't it? People feeling like they've been abandoned by the system, losing access to crucial support, and then they see those in power seemingly ignoring their struggles.
And then in that context, those online reactions to the CEO's death, even the extreme ones, start to make a little more sense.
Exactly. It becomes less about celebrating a death and more about expressing this deep, almost primal cry for help. Like, someone please listen to us. We're hurting and the system is failing us.
It's a powerful reminder that these aren't just these abstract policy debates. They have real consequences for real people. And those consequences can be devastating.
Absolutely. So what can we do about it? Lorenz calls for systemic change, things like universal health care and holding executives accountable. But how do we actually make those things happen?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's easy to point out the problems. But finding solutions, especially in a system as complex as healthcare, that's much harder.
Right, but I think the first step is awareness, just recognizing that these problems exist and that they're deeply rooted in our political and economic systems.
Okay, and then maybe instead of focusing on whether or not it's okay to make a dark joke on Twitter, we can start having some of those more difficult conversations about the things that are really driving that anger and frustration. Conversations about access to healthcare, the role of corporations in our society, and how we can create a system that's more equitable and just.
Absolutely. And those conversations need to happen everywhere, online, in our communities, in the halls of power. We need to demand more from our leaders, from our institutions, and from each other.
So listener, as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this final thought. Think back to all the reactions that we've discussed, from the cynical jokes to those heartbreaking stories of loss. What resonates most with you? What emotions did this story evoke in you? And most importantly, what do you think we can do collectively to move towards a better future?
We hope this deep dive has given you the information and the perspectives you need to grapple with these tough questions. And remember, even though it can feel overwhelming at times, your voice matters. Keep asking those questions, keep challenging the status quo, and keep pushing for the changes you want to see in the world. Thanks for joining us.
It really is a tough question to wrestle with. How do we deal with these big feelings? The anger, the grief, and even that sense of, vindication, but still remembering that a human life was lost.
It's tough, and it gets even more complicated when you add in the whole healthcare system, and the power of these big corporations. Lorenz actually connects this all back to the 2024 election, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, I remember that. She was pretty critical of how healthcare was talked about. Or not talked about, I guess you could say, during the campaigns.
Yeah, she pointed out that healthcare was a huge issue for voters, right? But it seemed like neither candidate was really willing to address it in a way that mattered. They focused on, other things like the economy and foreign policy. And when they did talk about healthcare, it was always so vague. No real plans for how to fix the problems people were facing.
It's almost like they were too scared to touch this issue because it's so controversial.
Right. But Lorenz says that's exactly what they should have been talking about, especially with all that anger and frustration that was already bubbling up,
Yeah.
She's especially tough on the Biden administration for going back on some of those healthcare benefits that had been put in place during the pandemic, like expanding Medicaid, paid sick leave, boosting unemployment. And all this while inflation was going up, incomes were flat, and more people were falling into poverty.
So basically, people were already having a hard time. And then the government takes away some of the support that's helping them get by. No wonder there's so much resentment.
Yeah, it's a pretty grim picture, isn't it? People feeling abandoned by the system, losing that crucial support, and then they see the people in charge ignoring them.
And in that light, those online reactions to the CEO's death, even the really harsh ones, start to make a bit more sense.
Exactly. It becomes less about being happy someone died and more about this desperate cry for help. Like, hey, somebody listen to us. We're hurting and the system's broken.
It's a reminder that we're not just talking about policies here. We're talking about real people with real struggles, and those struggles have real consequences.
Absolutely. So what can we do? I mean, Lauren says we need system-wide change. Things like universal healthcare, holding executives accountable. But how do we actually make those things happen?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's easy to see the problems, but coming up with solutions, especially with something as complicated as healthcare, is a lot harder.
It is. But I think recognizing that the problems exist is a good start. You know, understanding that these issues are deeply tied to our political and economic systems. That's important.
And then maybe instead of arguing about whether it's okay to make a dark joke on Twitter, we can start having tougher conversations about the things that are really causing all this anger and frustration. You know, conversations about how to access health care, the role of corporations in our lives, and how we build a system that's fairer for everyone.
Absolutely. Those conversations are important, and they need to be happening everywhere online in our communities and the places where decisions are made. We need to demand more from our leaders, from the systems we live in, and from each other.
So, listener, as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this. Think about all those reactions. We talked about the jokes, the sad stories. What stands out to you? How did this whole thing make you feel? And what do you think we can do to make things better?
We hope this deep dive gave you the info and the different viewpoints to really wrestle with these tough questions. And even though it can feel overwhelming, sometimes remember your voice matters. Keep asking those tough questions, keep challenging things, and keep fighting for the change you want to see in the world. Thanks for listening.